bunch of different projects called Sherman. It's on like read a bunch of code online and see what frankly I like most. Yeah, I have no idea. Okay, one of them got like let me know.
Wait for your cue.
I'm not good.
I'm good? All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming to today's Code School. We have a very special guest, Greg Maxwell. If you don't know who he is, you've not been paying attention to Bitcoin for the past, many, many years. Greg is one of the most prolific contributors to Bitcoin Core. He's done a lot of fundamental groundwork research for Bitcoin, as well as just cryptocurrencies at large. So he's here to talk about confidential transactions, which is a really important technology in terms of letting people have privacy, and allows for fungibility. So it's a really, I'm very honored to introduce him. Greg.
Thank you. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about confidential transactions today. And I look at confidential transactions as a building block piece of fundamental technology. It's not like an altcoin or something like that. It's not a turnkey system. It's some fundamental tech. And there are lots of different ways to use it and deploy it. And my interest in this technology is primarily driven by Bitcoin, but the technology here can be applied to many other things, including things outside of the cryptocurrency space. So I want to talk a little bit in detail about what motivates me in working on this, why I think it's interesting, and what specifically CT does, the costs of using CT in a system like Bitcoin and the benefits. And I want to talk a bit about extensions and related technology, and maybe the prospect of using CT more directly with Bitcoin in the future. I also have some slides to go into more detail about how CT works in sort of technical detail, but I'm not sure how much interest there is in getting into the really deep details here. So, feeling in the room, lots of details, little details. All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up. So we'll see how the time works out on it too, because I want to leave some good time for questions and such. And if I start blabbering off in space and someone's confused, please feel free to ask me to clarify. So, CT, it's a tool for improving privacy fungibility in a system like Bitcoin. So why is this important? If you look at traditional systems like banking systems, they provide a level of privacy in their systems, right? And when you use your bank account, your neighbors don't know what you're doing with your bank account. Your bank may know, but your bank knows, your counterparties know, and other people generally don't know. And this is very important for people. It's important both for personal reasons as well as for commercial reasons. In a business, you don't want your competition knowing who's supplying your parts. You don't necessarily want to be sharing who's being paid what. You don't want your competition to see when you make a big sale and to who that customer is going to and all of that, right? So there's a long list of commercial reasons why this kind of privacy is important. And personally as well, right? If you think about it, in order to speak as a person, to speak up in the political sphere, to have an effect on the world, you need to spend some money to do it. And so this is you basically have the case that your spending of money is integrally tied to your ability to have free speech in the world. And if someone can surveil and monitor and control your use of money all the time, they're also controlling your ability to speak. So this is, in fact, also the opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court in Citizens United. And a lot of people on the more liberal end of the spectrum don't like this conflation of money and free speech, but it cuts both ways. And people should have a high degree of financial privacy. And they can't have it if they're always using a system that doesn't provide that. So in Bitcoin, we have this fundamental conflict, though, where we've built this decentralized distributed network. And its security is based on this concept of public verification. You know Bitcoin is correct because your own computer running software that you or someone you trust has audited, has verified all of this history of it, and it's added it all up, right? That all the signatures match, all the values match, it's all good to go. And so it basically uses conspicuous transparency in order to obtain security. And so many people look at this and they think, there's a conflict. We can't both have strong privacy and have this public verification needed for a decentralized system. But this apparent conflict is not true. If you think about the idea of a digital signature, and that's a scheme that lets you sign a message and shows that a person who knows a private key approved the message, right? We use this every day in Bitcoin. You can use this and people can verify a digital signature without ever knowing your private key, but they can verify that you knew it, right? And so a digital signature is showing that you can build a system that can be publicly verified, but without actually giving away your secrets. So this whole idea that a system for money needed some kind of privacy isn't a new one. It's discussed in the Bitcoin white paper. And what the Bitcoin white paper says about it is basically that you can use pseudonyms, one-use addresses, in order to have privacy in the system. But the challenge that we found is that this is very, very fragile. And in practice, the pseudonymity in Bitcoin doesn't actually provide a whole lot of privacy. People reuse addresses, and then it's quite easy to trace the transaction graph through the system. The way the earliest Bitcoin software was written, you didn't usually pay to an address directly. You would provide an IP address, and then your node would go to the other node and get an address from it. And so then every payment would use a new fresh address on the blockchain. And that was a much more private way of using things, but it required that to receive payments that you had a node exposed to the internet, not hidden behind NAT. So not very usable. And that whole protocol, in fact, was completely unauthenticated, so it was very vulnerable to a man in the middle as well. So that wasn't a good way to transact, and as a result, people have started using addresses for everything. And the address model ends up causing lots of reuse and things that really degrade privacy. So when I've gone out and talked to institutions far outside of Bitcoin, out in the wider world, and talked about using Bitcoin itself as well as using blockchain sort of technology adopted from Bitcoin, one of the first concerns that many warring institutions, large banks and things like that, have brought up is this lack of privacy in Bitcoin, right? From all of these commercial angles. They're not so much concerned about protecting people's personal rights, but keeping your business deals secret is bread and butter of commerce. So the transparency that Bitcoin provides is often touted as a very powerful feature, right? Everyone can see the blockchain, so it's very transparent. But transparency is a feature that cuts both ways. And having an open blockchain doesn't mean your activities are transparent, right? You can have an open blockchain and everyone can see the transactions, but it doesn't mean that they have any wisdom, right? Data is not knowledge. Knowledge is not wisdom. And so this very open nature of Bitcoin, unless people take specific actions to turn that openness into transparency, isn't functionally transparency. And the lack of privacy in Bitcoin exacerbates existing power imbalances. If you're just some, nobody, and someone wants to block your transactions or mess around with you, you're made more vulnerable by the fact that your transactions are visible. And some people are concerned about harmful uses. If people want to use cryptocurrency for immoral activities, it might be argued that their lack of privacy is a feature, right? But it turns out that people doing criminal activities have money to blow, and they can afford to purchase privacy via expensive means, regardless, right? They don't look and say, oh, Bitcoin's not private. I guess I'm just going to have to make all my criminal activities completely visible. No, that's not how it works, right? Certainly, less privacy in Bitcoin can make investigations easier at times, but it doesn't fundamentally block criminal activity. So in my view, when we don't have good privacy in a system like Bitcoin, the criminal activity still occurs. It's just everyone else that can't afford to get privacy that suffers from it. And a key point that I don't have on the slide here that I think I should mention is that that privacy is integrally tied to fungibility. And the idea behind fungibility is that one coin is equivalent to every other coin. And this is an essential property for any money. And the reason it's essential is so that when you get paid, you know you've been paid. If instead you were being paid in a highly non-fungible asset, like some piece of art or whatever, you might receive a piece of art, think you were paid, and then later you find out the art is a forgery, or you find out that it's stolen and that you have to give it back. And so that art doesn't work as well as money, because one piece of art isn't as good as some other piece of art. So the more we can make our money-like asset behave in a fungible way, the better it is. And this is a well-recognized legal and social concept elsewhere, right? The US dollar is not physically fungible. $1 is very different than another dollar. In fact, they're serialized. But for the most part, as a society, we are willfully blind to the non-fungibility of the dollar bill, because if we say, hey, this dollar is counterfeit, but it's unidentifiably counterfeit, so it's no good, then the dollar breaks down as being a useful money. And so we ignore those things. And in cryptocurrency, we need to do a degree of that as well if you want cryptocurrency to be useful as money. So there have been many past proposals to improve privacy in the Bitcoin space. Many people have recognized there's a problem here. People have done things like proposals to combine CoinJoin and CoinSwap, which are completely compatible with the existing system and use some smart contracting protocol trickery to increase users' privacy. People have also used things like centralized servers where you trust a third party, you give them the money, they make the payments for you. And that can at times improve your privacy, except from the central server, where they usually destroy your security along the way. There have been cryptographic proposals. There's a proposal called ZeroCoin, which is distinct from the zero cash stuff that exists today, which had very poor scalability, but had some interesting privacy properties. There's a not well-known proposal called one-way aggregate signatures that showed up on Bitcoin Talk from an anonymous author and then just vanished. But it's a pretty interesting approach. There's the traceable ring signatures that were used in Bytecoin and Monero, and the more recent zero cash system, which has now shown up as an altcoin. So the compatible things like CoinJoin, have mostly suffered from not having as much privacy as you might expect because of transaction amount tracing. The idea behind a CoinJoin is that multiple parties come together and they jointly author a transaction, a single transaction that spends all of their money and pays out to a set of addresses. And by doing that, an observer can't tell which outputs matched with which inputs. And so the users gain privacy from doing this. But if all of the users are putting in and taking out different amounts, you can easily unravel the CoinJoin. And the requirement to make the amounts match to prevent that unraveling makes CoinJoin very hard to be usable. And then prior to CT, the cryptographic solutions that people have proposed have broken the pruning process in Bitcoin. So they've really harmed the scalability of the system, causing the state to balloon up forever. So today, you can run a Bitcoin full node with somewhere around 2 gigabytes of space on a system. And that's all it needs in order to validate new incoming blocks with all of the validation, all the rules, no trusting any third parties. And if not for pruning, then that number would be 120 gigabytes and rapidly growing, right? So many of these cryptographic privacy tools have basically broken this pruning and really hurt scaling. An exception being a more recent, this Tumblebit proposal. And Tumblebit is a proposal like CoinSwap that allows two users to swap ownership of coins in a secure way without the network being able to tell, someone observing the network being able to tell they did this. And Tumblebit improves the privacy of that by making the users themselves not able to tell who the other user was. And Tumblebit doesn't break scalability, but because it only does these swaps and a few other things, it's not as flexible as many of the other options. So, confidential transactions, what does it do? So the prior work on improving privacy in cryptocurrency systems has been entirely focused, or almost entirely focused, on making the transaction graph private, right? It's addressing this linkage between transactions. And this is kind of odd, because if you think about internet protocols, the transaction graph is like metadata. Who's talking to who? And metadata is absolutely information that needs to be private. But normally when we communicate on the internet, we don't worry so much about making our metadata private. If we do, we use something like Tor, right? We normally use SSL, which makes the content of our messages private. Well, the content of a transaction is the destination and the amounts involved. That's really the content of the transaction. And the prior privacy schemes, most of them didn't make the content private, which is a little surprising. Now, if you use one-use addresses, the destination's inherently pretty private, but the amount's not private. And in fact, in many commercial contexts at least, the amount is even more important to keep private, right? Knowing Alice is paying Bob is somewhat interesting, but knowing Alice is paying Bob $10,000 is much more interesting, right? So the amounts are pretty important. And One of the things on my slides a couple back that I didn't mention too is one of the things that we worry about in Bitcoin in particular, as we watch the the price rocket up, is the security implications of owning Bitcoins, right? If you own a bunch of Bitcoins, you generally don't want the world to know about it. And if you go into a Starbucks and try to pay for something with Bitcoin, you make a transaction and your transaction moves 1,000 Bitcoins at that time, like you got to worry that maybe the barista's calling your buddies out back to come, mug you and take your phone, right? So making the amounts private is important. So that's what confidential transactions does. It makes the amounts private, and there's a lot of benefits to this. The way this works is that there's normally in a transaction an 8-byte value that indicates the amount of an output. And that 8-byte value is replaced with this 33-byte commitment, which is functionally like a cryptographic hash. So instead of putting the amount in the transaction, you put a hash of the amount in the transaction. And these commitments, though, have a very special property that the hashing process preserves addition, which means that if you take the hash of one amount and the hash of another amount and add them together, you get something which is the hash of their sum. And this addition preserving property is what allows the network to still verify that the inputs and outputs still match up. So that's why CT can be verified by a public network, even though the information is private. So using this kind of scheme for Bitcoin was proposed by Adam Back in 2013 on Bitcoin Talk. And I assume these slides will be up. There's links and all of these things too. And Adam's post is like really hard to understand, and even for me. And so just knowing that he said you could do it, I went and reinvented the scheme and also came up with a much more efficient construction than he had proposed. And in fact, the constructions that I used for CT were by a large factor more efficient than any other system in the literature previously. And that's required in order to possibly think about using these things in a large-scale public system. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So on that subject, cost. Doing this stuff with the hidden values isn't cheap in the system. So the end result is that on the plus side, we can do it with no new cryptographic assumptions, meaning that CT is completely secure so long as our ECC signatures are secure. And in fact, we can do even better so that CT is completely secure against inflation, even if ECC is completely broken. I'll talk a bit more about that. So that's a good part. Downside. So it's roughly on the order of a 66% increase in the UTXO set size. So that's manageable. We're talking about current state of 2 gigabytes. Well, let's just say doubling it, right? That's reasonable. But it also results in something in the order of a 15 to 20x increase in the amount of bandwidth needed for transactions. Now, CT is completely prunable, so you don't have to keep around that extra data, but you do have to carry it around initially. It also results in, compared to ordinary signature validation, a 30 to 60x increase in validation costs. So if you could assume all of your nodes are high-end hardware and that they're not going to validate the old history, taking a 30x increase in validation cost is all right because there's extensive caching in sort of Bitcoin node software, but it's a factor. It does also result in addresses which are twice the length. The reason that addresses are longer is because CT needs to include an additional public key in the address, which is used to effectively encrypt a message to the receiver so they know how much you're paying them. Otherwise, they won't know how much you're paying them. And there's a complexity hit. The main part of my implementation of CT adds about 1,400 lines of code. And this is pretty small compared to the rest of the crypto code in Bitcoin, but it's a cost. It's as small as it is because I was able to heavily leverage existing infrastructure as well. So what benefits do we get out of this? Well, the amounts are private. And that has some direct effects. For example, in many cases, you need fewer transactions or outputs in order to preserve privacy. Today, if you were to do something like decide to pay all of your staff in Bitcoin, but you didn't want to disclose how much everyone was being paid, you'd probably get your staff to provide you with lots of addresses per staff member. And then you'd pay the same amount to addresses, and people that receive different amounts would get different numbers of payouts, right? So that would be reasonably private until people go and spend those outputs in groups and reveal some of it. but it would be very inefficient because it would require much larger transactions to do this. So I think that making amounts private really does solve many of the commercial interests with it. So that's the big win directly. Now, on this privacy that CT provides, it's controllable by the user. So the sender obviously knows what he sent. The receiver obviously knows what he received. But additionally, either the sender or the receiver can show to any third party all the details of the transaction. So I can prove to you, hey, here was this payment, I was paid, here's the amount. I can publish it to the world. Here's a particular payment, here's its amount. So my ability to prove a payment is not reduced by CT. And moreover, it's straightforward in the design and implementation of CT to share kind of a per wallet master key with an auditor, and the auditor can see all of this information. And so you can share whatever you want with whomever you want. You control that. One other side effect of the design is that there's this, I mentioned, this 15 to 20x increase in transaction bandwidth. So transactions are larger, but 80% of that increase can be reused to communicate a private memo from the sender to the receiver. And this private memo can contain structured or unstructured arbitrary data from the one side to the other side. So in a typical transaction, there'd be several kilobytes of memo field. Unfortunately, we can't eliminate this data overhead, but we can let it get dual use, right? It's part of the cryptographic proof for CT, but it also lets you send data. One of the other benefits of using CT in a system is that it's quite straightforward to do private solvency proofs over CT. So if you were to imagine if Bitcoin were using CT today, you would be able to construct a proof that says, I own 1,000 Bitcoins, at least 1,000 Bitcoins, out of the set of all Bitcoins that exist. So if everyone was using CT, the privacy set would be all of the Bitcoins. And you could prove this to someone without revealing which coins are yours, or without showing you the exact amount, just a threshold. In fact, you can do even more than that. You can build a system that allows, like in a bank-like situation, you could show that, or an exchange, you could show that the user's account balances all add up to the sum of the assets without showing what that sum is. So you could say something like Coinbase, for example, that the user's account balances add up to the sum, add up to the sum of coins that Coinbase holds. And prove that to people without revealing anything about the number of users, without revealing anything about the total amounts. It's possible to do this in a system like Bitcoin without CT, just sort of by layering CT over on top of it. But then you don't get a full privacy set, right? If you're the only person using that solvency proofing system, then your coins are revealed by it. But if everyone used CT, then the set would be complete. And there's a paper on doing this called the provisions paper that discussed doing this. So I've said that CT provides value privacy, but in fact, it also indirectly provides metadata privacy, graph privacy. And the reason for this is that the existing compatible non-cryptographic proposals for doing graph privacy, like CoinJoin, are primarily broken by their lack of amount privacy. Also, their usability is broken by the lack of amount privacy. And so CoinJoin itself, or CT itself, can be easily combined with CoinJoin so that you can have multiple people that together collaborate to create a transaction. They don't learn the amounts the other people are transacting, and the third party observing doesn't know whose inputs match whose outputs. And then, because the amounts are private, you lose the problem that CoinJoin has where all the amounts have to match. They don't have to match anymore. So it makes it much more usable, much more private. And so if you do that, you end up with both data and metadata privacy without breaking the scalability. So this preserves all of the same good scaling properties of CT alone. And this is also true for coin swaps, and Tumblebit, for example, would be made more private by CT and many other techniques as well. So although CT has these significant costs, I would actually say that one of CT's advantages is scalability. The costs involved in CT are constant factors. They're pretty big constant factors, but they're constant factors. It doesn't change the asymptotic scaling system. All of the overhead that CT creates, or almost all of it, is prunable. So it will blow up the history of the chain, but the state required to run a node and continue verifying things doesn't increase that much. Other schemes for privacy result in these perpetual growing states where you have to keep something closer to the full blockchain history on every node. And I think that CT plus CoinJoin and technologies based on it, like Mimblewimble, which I'll talk about in a bit, are the only strong privacy approaches that don't break scalability for these kinds of systems. So another benefit you can see from looking at something like CT is something I would call Decentralization Offset, which is, we talked before about how fungibility is important, but in systems like Bitcoin, there's a risk that miners or other ecosystem players might discriminate against certain coins or be forced by third parties to discriminate against certain coins. And if they did that, and if they did enough of it, it would degrade the value of the system. It would make it less useful as a money. Although it might be profitable for the parties doing it. You can get paid to perhaps discriminate against coins. There was some earlier pre-pub work in this MIT Chainacre paper. They'd since removed this from their publication, but suggested actually paying Bitcoin miners to only mine approved transactions, for example. And my response to this isn't to be angry about it, like it's a vulnerability in the system, right? So let's fix it. And what I would point out here is that if a system is more fungible, then issues related to the centralization limits in other parts of the system are less of an issue, because the coins all look the same, so you can't discriminate against them. So that's an advantage, I think, here. So I mentioned before that CT is at least as strong as the ECC, but it's actually potentially stronger. So the scheme in our original CT publication provides what's called unconditional privacy, but only computational soundness. And what unconditional privacy means is that even if you were to get an infinitely powerful computer, like it solves any problem in one operation, you still could not remove the amount privacy in CT. The privacy part of it cannot be broken. But it only provides computational soundness, which means that if ECC is broken or someone has an infinitely powerful computer, they can basically make CT proofs that are false and create inflation. And it's fundamentally impossible for any scheme to achieve both unconditional privacy and unconditional soundness. It's basically got to have one or the other. It could miss both as well, but it can't have both of them. So for use in Bitcoin, it probably makes more sense to have a system that has computational privacy. So if the crypto is broken, you lose your privacy, but unconditional soundness, meaning you know for absolute certainty that the coins can't be inflated by the system. Now, I'm not particularly concerned about ECC being broken that we use in Bitcoin. And if it were broken, we have bigger problems. But for a system that you want people to adopt, you've got to answer all the FUD, right? And if you could even theoretically possibly have unending inflation that's hidden away in the system, that's a pretty good FUD point. And I think it would be important for Bitcoin to fix it. When we first worked on CT, we knew that we could solve the soundness and make it unconditionally sound, but we thought that it was going to make it a lot less efficient. It turns out we found ways to make it equally efficient while preserving the unconditional soundness. And this is something that we've been working on a while. Also, Oleg at Chain has been working on the unconditional soundness for CT. And we have some implementations that I haven't published yet that do this. So let me talk some comparisons with other technologies. And I'm talking about more the technology than the altcoin in cases where this stuff is implemented. So CT versus Zcash, right? Zcash uses some very, very modern cryptography to do some really cool stuff. And effectively, Zcash directly hides the amount and the transaction metadata, and it hides it completely. So among all the private transactions in Zcash, you can't tell what the linkage is between any of them. That's even stronger than like a CoinJoin can provide. So it's basically perfect from that perspective. But you always have to be careful when thinking about just a little perspective at a time. So Zcash isn't unconditionally sound and cannot be made unconditionally sound with current technologies, not even close. In fact, Zcash requires a trusted setup, meaning that a number of trusted parties have to get together, and if they cheat, they can break the crypto and create unbounded, undetectable inflation. So if there's a crypto break or the trusted setup were broken, very bad news. Now, they did a bunch of stuff in the Zcash altcoin with having a good ritual to increase trust. The trusted setup is trustworthy. But they may have to redo this procedure to upgrade the crypto over time. So it's a vulnerability. Zcash involves a growing accumulator. So there is basically a spent coins list that all nodes have to have. That spent coins list will grow forever. And Zcash is not just using one new piece of crypto. It's kind of a stack of new crypto on top of new crypto on top of new crypto. And I spoke with Dan Bonet, the author of the pairing cryptography, sort of the base layer that Zcash is built on. And I asked him, well, what do you think about the security of pairing? And he says, oh, yeah, it's great. And I said, well, what do you think about the security of snarks, which is sort of the next layer in the Zcash scheme? And he sort of shrugged and went, I don't know, it's new. So not to say that it isn't secure, but it's really new, and that's a big hurdle. There have also been recent advances in breaking the kind of crypto that's used in Zcash that will eventually require that they upgrade to larger curves at a minimum. Because right now they have somewhere in the order of 80 to 96-bit security, which isn't really considered all that strong. And particularly with those upgrades, their verification speed, right now it's about on par with CT, and it would be half, maybe a quarter after those upgrades in the future. So verification's comparable to CT, but a bit slower. The real killer right now in practice for Zcash is that the signing speed is horribly slow. We're talking like minute scale operations to sign a private transaction. And as a result, Zcash couldn't plausibly make the private transactions mandatory, so they're optional. And as a result, very few of the transactions in the Zcash chain actually use the private transaction feature. If you just look at the raw numbers, it's 24%, but that number is a bit of misleading because miners are required to pay to a private address, but most miners are mining pools, and the mining pools immediately unblind those coins. And if you sort of separate out the mining load, maybe it's in the order of 4% to Zcash transactions or private. And as a result, the anonymity set that this perfect anonymity system is achieving isn't really all that good. I think it's a cool thing, and I'm really glad that people are trying it out. But it's not the kind of proposal that I'd want to take to something like Bitcoin today. So Monero is another altcoin that uses a privacy technique that was first in Bytecoin, which is an altcoin with probably the scammiest launch of anything I have ever seen. But Monero is the reboot of Bytecoin that removed the ridiculous pre-mine and 5 years of faked history and obfuscated mining code and who knows what else, right? But what was really cool about Bytecoin is it actually had cool crypto in it that hadn't been discussed before. And so the idea behind the Bytecoin scheme was to use a ring signature. And a ring signature lets you basically say, I'm spending one of these 4 coins, and I won't tell you which one, but I'll prove to you that it hasn't been spent before, whichever one it was. So this hides the graph. But the privacy of Monero or Bytecoin originally was very, very fragile, and a vast majority of transactions were easily de-anonymized, largely because of the amount non-privacy that basically made things visible in the system. So more modern Monero, as of a few months ago, is now using CT. So they've adapted CT to work with their ring signatures to create something called ring CT, and it's sort of like how CT can be combined with CoinJoin. So this system has the benefits of CT, but it also has the disadvantages of the ring signature. So there's a forever growing spent coins list in it. Monero isn't today unconditionally sound, but it could be. All of the crypto in it, just like CT, can be upgraded to unconditional soundness. Monero could be as well. And the crypto assumptions are the same as CT, although Monero uses a different curve. They use the ED 25519 curve instead of the 50 curve. But otherwise, it's the same crypto assumptions. The other cryptographically private altcoin that people talk about a fair bit is Dash. Dash isn't cryptographically private at all. Actually, I had a slide in the deck that was like Dash LOL and like nothing else. I don't know what they're it's snake oil, right? And I'm just sort of beside myself about it, personally. What Dash has is a system that's like CoinJoin. You don't need a new cryptocurrency for CoinJoin. And they nominate nodes based on proof of stake to be CoinJoin masters. They've done this insecurely many times in the past. I have no clue if the current version is secure or not, but it's not really on the same level as something like Zcash or Monero. Maybe it's better than doing nothing. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. LOL, right? So there are other risks of this technology to talk about. I guess really I was talking about one of them right now is that it's difficult to distinguish snake oil from real stuff and like vet claims. Maybe some of the stuff I said today was crap. I'm sure that someone will complain that like I said that CT was unconditionally private because of how it's actually used. Maybe it's not quite unconditionally private, right? Like it's hard to work out this stuff and know what complaints are legitimate. It's a new area, not too many experts, lots of people that sound like experts. But a big one is that if you look at any one of these cryptocurrency systems, the consensus part of it is itself a crypto system, just like RSA or AES or whatever. The whole thing's got to work exactly right. And if one part is wrong, then it won't give the properties you think it will. So it's very hard to get crypto systems right. And if you get them wrong, the effects are devastating. Complexity is the enemy of integrity. It's hard to verify it. Privacy techniques do make the systems more complex. So I'm currently aware of 3.5 devastating failures related to privacy improvements in systems. So there's an altcoin based on the original Zcoin proposal, which had an inflation incident where, like, more or less what looks like a typo made it possible for people to mint coins out of nothing. And in that case, they just let the system inflate some, and the people sold their coins. They just said, okay, now there's more coins. So the loss was effectively socialized. Because this was caught, fortunately due to some of the privacy limitations in their approach, the loss wasn't very large and they could socialize it, right? But if instead the attacker had printed billions and billions of coins, the system would be completely over. There's a system called Shadow Cash, which is a clone of the Bytecoin-like, Monero-like ring signatures with no CT based on the Bitcoin code base. And it had no privacy at all. I don't know if the person building it was like a complete fool or utter genius, but they managed to make a really subtle mistake that made it have no privacy. The upgrade to Monero called Ring CT that has now been deployed, the original version of it was unsound and could result in undetectable unbounded inflation due to basically a protocol design error. When they created Ring CT, they didn't copy the design of CT, they sort of reinvented it again. I guess I'm guilty of that too, but I'm not quite sure why they did that. But in any case, they broke it while doing so. And this made it through peer review into the Ledger cryptographic journal. But it was detected both by the Monero team and someone at my company before it was implemented in the system, and they fixed it. And as far as anyone knows, the current system is sound. But so that's my half break. And there's another one which is currently non-public, but it'll be public in a couple of months. That was a total break of one of these kinds of things. It isn't a concern now, but you know, we have to learn from all of these mistakes as time goes on. So I don't really think that these privacy systems are really much harder than normal consensus work in cryptocurrencies, but the failures are really severe and really obvious and sometimes hard or impossible to recover from. And it's also a place where people are actually doing something interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on in cryptocurrency, which is just hot air or copying. This cryptographic privacy stuff is real. So I want to talk a little bit about where we can go from CT today. And maybe I should have had a slide here to say where we are. I've published a complete high-performance implementation of CT. It's part of this demo Elements Alpha sidechain that Blockstream's put out. It's used in our Liquid product. It's out there, it's available, it's described, it's been included in academic publications. It's like, it's real. It's still being improved. So where can we go with this technology beyond that? Well, I think the most interesting one is Mimblewimble. So I propose that CT is pretty powerful when combined with CoinJoin. But CoinJoin is interactive. All of the parties in the join have to be online and communicate with each other. It can be made using some properties of CT. This CoinJoin can be made non-interactive. So this can allow miners to aggregate together transactions to improve scalability and their privacy. And some of the properties of this aggregation make it actually possible to sync a node without looking at the history, but only looking at the UTXO set, but have the same security as if you had inspected the entire history. So basically having the same security properties as Bitcoin, but without having to transfer the history. The downside of it is that the state for a verifying node is massively increased. So the end result for the particular parameters for Mimblewimble is that if Bitcoin were Mimblewimble from day one, the UTXO set would be, or the equivalent of the UTXO set would be the size of the blockchain. But you wouldn't need the blockchain in order to sync a node. So the asymptotics are good, the constant factors stink, and it's interesting technology that people are experimenting with and enhancing. Another enhancement that I've been working on is multi-asset. So CT, as we've been describing it, works with like a single asset, right? A cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, or whatever, right? But it's possible to extend CT so that you can have many different asset types which are kept separately. So you can think of like color coins. And in doing so, you basically provide privacy for what kinds of assets are being traded. And for a low volume asset, just knowing that it's being traded at all is the really important thing that you need to keep private. Several groups have been working on this. Chain recently had an announcement about it, and at Blockstream we published a paper at FC17 and also put out a working implementation, also part of that Elements demo system. And so I think this is a cool area, and we'll see where it goes. And it's, I think, very neat that you can just combine these kinds of approaches. And we'll probably come up with more other things like this that can be combined with it. So I mentioned many times CT plus CoinJoin, interesting. The normal way you do CoinJoin in practice today is that you have the participants either pick a participant or a server, and the server sort of mediates it. And the server learns stuff about the correspondence between the users. And that's not good. So it's possible to have a protocol where all of the participants in the join just work with each other. No one learns the input-output mapping. And I knew it was possible when CoinJoin was created, but I didn't, or when CT was created, but I didn't work out any of the details. Fortunately, other people have been working on this. And there's a paper on a system called Value Shuffle that works out how you can have a multi-party CoinJoin with all the parties private from each other using CT. And the area where I think I've been focusing the most on related to CT is efficiency, right? Those cost numbers, as I said, they're constant factors, but they're big constant factors. It would be good to get them down. So we have schemes right now that can make them 20% smaller or the same size but unconditionally sound. And there's more optimizations out there to be worked on. This is an area that Oleg at Chain's also been working on. So I should mention about patents. I've patented the techniques, many of the optimizations in the confidential transactions with the explicit, intentional, and very loudly stated goal of using the patents to prevent other people from patenting the stuff, right? So Blockstream has a very open patent policy that is purely defensive. It's been applauded by many groups, including the EFF. If it's not good enough for someone, I want to know about it. We'll make it better. We can't make the patent system go away, and it's a risk to any public deployment of complex technologies. I worked previously on royalty-free multimedia codecs. I'm one of the authors of the Vorbis codec, the Opus audio codec that's used WebRTC and like anyone that uses signals using Opus. And we use patents strategically in Opus to get other patents open. And so trying to do the same thing with CT. And so I don't think there's any reason that anyone needs to worry about patents in CT. This is good news, but if someone is worried, glad to make the situation better. So what about using the CT thing with Bitcoin? Well, you can use it with Bitcoin, the asset, already by using sidechains. And that's what we're doing with Liquid, for example. So you can build a system that trades Bitcoin value and uses CT to make it private inside that system. It's just not private going in and out of it. If you want to talk about doing CT in a public system like Bitcoin, the efficiency is a real challenge. There are some really cool, hacky Bitcoin Wizardy tricks that we can do to move around the costs in the system. Particularly, there's a notion that every spend that creates a coin, it could be possible for the miners to basically perform all the validations, and if you make an invalid CT proof with your coin, the miner could publish a proof that your CT proof was invalid and confiscate your coins for doing it. So there's some trade-offs that can possibly be done to make it so that not everyone needs to verify the CT stuff and make it cheaper. Obviously, politics are a potential hurdle. Some people do not want Bitcoin to gain stronger privacy for various reasons. Some people probably don't want Bitcoin to improve at all. But I think that strong privacy in altcoins and the existence of CT and other tools and sidechains will moot these arguments. I don't think that if CT is a really good thing that Bitcoin should be using, that people are going to stand by and not use it while competing systems do, at least not forever. There are designs for doing a soft fork CT, so deploying it in a backwards compatible manner. But right now, they have some severe limitations. In particular, if the chain reorganizes when coins have been moved out of CT back into non-CT transactions, the transactions around that reorganization won't survive. So imagine you move some coins out of CT, you basically have to have a protocol rule that you can't spend those coins for like 100 blocks after they've been moved out of CT. This is the same reason, or same issue for the same reason that extension block proposals have. And it's one of the reasons I haven't been historically too excited about extension block proposals. If it's the only way to do it, then maybe it's a viable way. But I'd really like to find something better. I haven't yet. But there have been many things in Bitcoin that I've looked at and said, I don't know how to do it. And later it turned out that there were ways of doing it. So the technology behind CT is still maturing, right? So if the reason for it not being deployed is that 15x bandwidth increase is too much, well, right, is 10x enough, right? And with improvements, we can get it down to lower amounts. So while the technology improves, it may make some of this easier. But it's certainly not, if it is ever like a proper in Bitcoin thing, it certainly wouldn't be a assumed thing as well. And I'm happy to help with other people experiment on it. Charlie's asked me about, CT and Litecoin, and I think it's even premature to do CT and Litecoin today, but I'd like to see it get more use, right? That's how the technology matures. So I want to go now to, let's see what the time is. Oh, I'm really short on time. So why don't I go to questions? And so I have slides here on more of the details on how it works, but maybe people can look at them offline, and I'm happy to answer questions even in email. So, but I should leave some time for questions. So, thanks. Questions?
Can you talk a bit about range proofs, why they're needed and what they do?
Yeah, so let me go to my details and how this stuff is done. So I'm going to do the really, really fast description of what CT is doing. First, my slides talk about you need a commitment scheme, right? Commitment is where you say you have some secret text and announce, and I want to prove to you that I've committed to the secret text without telling you the secret text. We can do it with a hash function. Take a hash of the secret text, give you the hash, and later I can show you the secret text of my notes and you can verify it. That's a commitment scheme. For CT, we need a commitment scheme that obeys this property. The commitment of A with its nonce and the commitment of B with its nonce is equal to the commitment of A plus B and nonce plus nonce. We need that property. You can't get that with a normal hash function. Definitely. So we introduced a thing called Peterson commitments. And where we use some properties of cyclic groups, like ECC is one of these things. Whenever someone talks about ECC, if they start talking about like actual numbers and doing arithmetic with the details behind the points, like they're really sort of wasting your time. Because one of the key points about elliptic curve cryptography and all discrete log cryptography, it's based on abstract algebra. Abstract algebra is abstract. So the properties of algebra just generally work, and you don't need to worry about what's happening under the hood. In any case, what a Peterson commitment is a way of doing commitment that has this additively homomorphic property where you can basically take these commitments and add them up. Great, hooray, they can be added up. I explain this here, it's beautiful. So the problem that arises is that the addition is cyclic, like adding an unsigned integer on a computer. It overflows. And so if I make a transaction that overflows, I could potentially create coins from nothing, right? I could have one coin in, plus 2 coins in, plus effectively a really large value, a -10 value, an overflowing value out, and 13 value out. And that all adds up to 0, right? It nets out. And so in that case, I will have effectively created 10 coins out of nothing. And so for CT to work, we need to prove that all of our committed values aren't just committed values. We need to prove that they're all small values, that they're all in a range of 0 to 2 to the 32. And if you add up together a bunch of 32-bit numbers, the value will still fit in 64 or 256 bits or whatever. And so almost all of the performance cost and size of CT is in proving that a value is small. And the way that you prove that a value is small is first we have a scheme to prove that a value is either 0 or another number. We do this with a ring signature. We say that this pub key is a pub key that corresponds to the 0 commitment or a 1 commitment. Or we just do this over and over again. So we prove this value is a 0 or 1. We prove this value is a 0 or 2. We prove this value is a 0 or 4. And we add them all up together and we prove that it's equal to the value that we're talking about. And if you built up a number out of these ors, then it must be in range. So that's what the range proof does. But in order to do this, it's pretty large. So typical size for a range proof covering 32 bits is about 2.5 kilobytes. But we can recover 80% of that for messaging. We have a bunch of optimizations in CT. There's an exponent field. So most Bitcoin values are round numbers in base 10. So you can sort of shift up the values that you're using by multiples of 10 in order to use a smaller proof to cover a larger range. So normally 32 bits would cover up to 42 Bitcoins. But if you add a couple of zeros in there, it covers 42,000 Bitcoins, for example. I hope that answered where the range proof stuff comes from. More questions? You can ask me about non-CT stuff too if you run out of CT stuff. I know you've got those things. I also have my slides, more details, including a write-up that I go into fair detail about how CT and the range proofs work, and then a paper that we wrote on the new ring signature started out of.
This might be a bit complicated, but can you talk a little bit more about how you make, how you use the range proofs to include sort of arbitrary user-selected data? Because that seems magical.
Yeah, I feel really clever for coming up with that. Probably one of the things I'm most proud of. So it's actually really simple. I wish I had a whiteboard, but I don't have time anyways. But in a ring signature, most of the values used in it are dummy values. They're just random. The signer picks random values, puts them in, solves through, uses their private key to solve one value, and then sends it on. So you're basically saying my message is signed by key A, key B, key C, or key D, right? And the signatures for 3 of the 4 dummies, and the 4th is computed based on the other 3. And so it doesn't matter what values they have, other than a third-party observer has to not be able to distinguish them for random. But an encrypted message has the property that a third-party observer can't distinguish them from random. And so we can just replace all of the randomness inside the range proof with an encrypted message that the receiver can decode. It doesn't need to be private from the receiver because the receiver knows the value being transacted. And in fact, we use this receiver kind of unraveling the range proof for the receiver to learn the value. So we don't have to communicate that explicitly in the scheme. Also, one of the cool things about this message size thing, so one thing I found in Bitcoin is that for proposals to be accepted by lots of people, they kind of have to have different advantages to different factions. So someone might look at a proposal and say, I don't care if we can gain X. Oh, but we can gain Y? So the fact that CT gives this messaging thing sort of embedded in it for free is something that might help it get adopted. For people that don't care about the privacy at all, but they really want a big memo field, maybe has preferential pricing in terms of the system's fees and limits, might be a reason that people would want to use it too. Any others?
What are your latest? This is not CT. What are your latest thoughts about mining centralization, and how are you thinking about that these days?
It's been a long-term challenge for Bitcoin in general, right? There's all kinds of market effects that result in mining centralization, including the fact that many mining things have been basically scams, and that scares out sensible investors from getting themselves involved in it. It's going to be an ongoing challenge in Bitcoin, and we've known this since 2012 or something like that. Better privacy technology obviously can reduce some of the effects of mining centralization. I'm of the opinion that in the long run, mining's kind of a boring business to be in. It's not even as good of a business to be in as like electricity production. And I hope that I think there's plausible reasons to believe that on the long term will drive mining towards decentralization just to gain access to all of the cheap power everywhere in the world. But I do think that everyone in the Bitcoin industry should be looking to see what opportunities they can take to help mining decentralization, including things like making small investments in mining farms and things like that, even if they're not core to the business or big money makers, but just to help spread it out, because the system really does depend on it. And it's important that it be widely spread, not even competently operated, but widely spread. It isn't all that competently operated today anyways.
Some people make the argument that for real fungibility, privacy has to be mandatory. It sounds like I guess what do you think about that argument? And if it was introduced, if CT was introduced into Bitcoin, would it be most likely optional or mandatory?
So I think that argument has a lot of merit, and I think that we've seen practical experience that proves it out, right? In particular, in the Zcash case. But I don't think that it's really viable to make it mandatory in Bitcoin. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's a longer-term question. It depends also on the costs, right? Like the way that Bitcoin transactions are costed out is a product of the system. There's no like physical law that says they have to be costed out a particular way. So an example of one way that CT could be deployed is that every transaction, in terms of its weight impact, its impact on the block limits, could be charged as though it has CT, whether it has it or not, right? And then there wouldn't at least be a strong disadvantage to using it. In fact, it would be an advantage even if you didn't want it, just to get the messaging and things like that. So I don't know. I think the argument's got a lot of merit, though, but I don't see a way to just, foist it onto people that don't want it. But this is an advantage that some system like Monero has right from the start that's really hard to match.
I have to ask you, how excited are you about SegWit activating on Litecoin?
It'll be interesting. I think it's cool to see it get used more, but I already knew that was going to happen. Maybe I'm deluded, but I expect good technology to get used eventually. In Litecoin, there's some interesting challenges related to miners and people with a large vested interest in making SegWit have problems. I don't think it's a risk for Litecoin. The size and scale and operational Litecoin, it'll get over whatever problems people want to create. But it may be bumpy. I'm happy to help out. I posted the other day on one of the Litecoin subreddit pointing out some potential causes of turbulence in Litecoin, and I don't think they're especially concerning, but they're things that can be mitigated, and it's good to know about them. So it should be cool. And I am happy about it. You're gonna end up with all the Bitcoin developers coming to work on Litecoin though eventually, because I'll tell you what, no one really doing a lot of protocol development in Bitcoin wants to work on script enhancements and things like that without SegWit, because it makes so much of that stuff much easier. And the idea of trying to do some kind of script enhancement without it is just not interesting. Over there.
Oh yeah, it's working. What do you think is preventing, or how would you accelerate the mainstream adoption of digital currencies like Bitcoin?
I think that we have a long way to go from maturity, right? Like not just the technology, but also all the on-ramps, off-ramps. There's a lot of infrastructure that exists, and having the right message and narrative for what they do for people. If you look at a public who's living entirely off of credit, for example, Joe Schmo credit user, what does cryptocurrency do for him? None of the cryptocurrencies today really provide credit, so how's he going to use it? And I think that in the long run, we will have infrastructure for credit in the cryptocurrency world. We absolutely will have it, but we don't have it today. And there's a lot of things like that. If you look at the pace of other really transformative technology, whether it be like the phone network, automobiles, or the internet, they really had long generational incubation periods. Like the internet went from like slightly visible to super visible in just a couple of years, but it took decades for the internet to get to the state it was in the 90s. And I think that we're going to see that with cryptocurrency too. And you're basically asking people to reboot how they do trust, reboot how they handle money. There are little ways that we'll adopt it in their lives. There's already big name companies that use cryptocurrency for international payments and for hedging of various kinds. Sort of like how Linux is important to people as well, right? Like most computers in the world that are sophisticated enough to have an operating system run Linux, but like no desktop people pretty much are using Linux. It's just permeated the infrastructure of the internet. But Joe Schmo is not really aware of it, even though it's on his phone. So I think we'll see growth like that for Bitcoin and more other consumer use so long as all the other infrastructure keeps up with it. And it's just going to take time.
Well, I think we're out of time, so